Oui, oui, monsieur, you are correct. This is not the original crucifix. There has been a substitution. The old antiquary nodded mysteriously, fixing his eyes upon mine. He spoke in a whisper because it was the vigil feast of the crucifix, and the once famous church was full of semi-clerical persons decorating it, and old ladies in strange caps clatching about with pails and brooms. The antiquary had brought me there the moment that I'd arrived in the town, lest the crowd of faithful should prevent his showing me everything the next morning. The famous crucifix was exhibited now behind rows of unlit candles, surrounded by strings of paper flowers and garlands of sweet resinous pine. Two lighted chandeliers illuminated it. There has been an exchange, he repeated in a whisper. I'd remarked, you see, well, as anyone would have done at first glance, that the crucifix before us now had every appearance of being a French work of the 13th century, whereas the object of the legend, which was said to have been the work of St. Luke himself, which had hung for centuries in the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem, and which had been miraculously cast ashore in 1195, would surely have been a more or less Byzantine-looking image, like its miraculous companion at Lucca. But why should there have been a substitution? I asked. Said the antiquary. Later. Well, he took me all round the church, once so famous for its pilgrimages, but from which, like the sea, which has left it in a salt marsh beneath the cliffs, the tide of devotion has receded over the centuries. It is a dignified, compact building of charmingly restrained and shapely Gothic, built of a delicate pale stone, which the sea damp has picked out with stains of a lovely bright green. The old man showed me where the transept and belfry had been left unfinished when the miracles had diminished in the 14th century. And he took me to the curious warden's chamber, a large room up some steps in the triforium with a fireplace and stone seats for the man who had guarded the precious crucifix day and night. There'd even been beehives on the window, he told me. He remembered seeing them as a child. Was it usual here in Flanders, I asked, to have a guard room in churches containing important relics? I can't remember having seen anything like this before. No, he answered. And then looking round to make sure that we were alone, but it was necessary here, monsieur. You have never heard what the miracles of this church were? No, I whispered back. Unless you mean the legend that the figure of the Saviour broke all the crosses until the right one was cast up by the sea. He shook his head, but said no more, and descended the steep stairs to the nave. Well, I lingered for a moment, looking down at it from the warder's chamber. I've never had so curious an impression of a church before. The chandeliers on either side of the crucifix swirled slowly round, making great pools of light, which were broken by the shadows of the clustered columns. The place was full of the scent of pine branches, and from the busy groups below rose a subdued chatter of women's voices, the splash of water and the clatter of pattens. It vaguely suggested to me preparations for a witch's Sabbath. What sort of miracles did they have then in the church? I asked when we passed out into the dusky square. And what did you mean about a substitution of the crucifix? The church rose black before us now, against the watery moonlit sky, a vague lopsided mass of buttresses and high-pitched roofs. The big trees of the churchyard behind wavered about in the sea wind, and the windows shone yellow in the darkness. Monsieur, regardez les gargouilles, the gargoyles, said the antiquary, pointing upwards. And, well, I must say they were impressive. Vague wild beasts, or rather like wolves, jutting out from the roof line. And what was positively frightening, you saw the moonlight, yellow and blue, through the open jaws of some of them. They seemed positively to howl, I said. Ah, well, the church has witnessed strange things, monsieur, and it remembers them. Now, as he spoke, there suddenly mingled with the sough of the wind and the groans of the weather vane a shrill, quavering sound, like pipers inside. The organist rehearses for tomorrow, said the antiquary, and he turned to go. Next day, I bought one of the printed histories of the crucifix, which they were hawking around the church. And the next day also, the antiquary was good enough to share what he knew of the matter. Now, between these two informants, the following, I think, may be said to be the true story. So, in the autumn of 1195, after a night of frightful storm, a boat was found cast upon the shore of the town of Dune, which was at that time a fishing village at the mouth of the River Nee and exactly opposite a treacherous sunken reef. The boat was broken, and close to it, on the sand and bent grass, lay a stone figure of the crucified Saviour, without its cross, and, as seems probable, also without its arms, which must have been made of separate blocks. Now, a variety of persons at once came forward to claim this. The little church of Dune, on whose glebe it was found, the barons of Croix, who had the right of jetsam on that coast, but also the great abbey of Saint-Loup of Arras, as possessing the spiritual overlordship of the place. But a holy man who lived close by in the cliffs had a vision which settled the dispute. St. Luke appeared to him in person and told him that he was the maker of the figure, that it had been one of three which had once hung around the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, that 3 knights, a Norman, a Tuscan, and a man of Arras, had, with the permission of heaven, stolen them from the infidels and placed them on unmanned boats, that one of the images had been cast upon the Norman coast near St. Salinel, that the second had run aground not far from the city of Lucca in Italy, and that this third was the one which had been embarked by a knight from Arras, from Artois. Now, as regarded its final resting place, the hermit, on the authority of St. Luke, recommended that the statue should be left to decide the matter for itself. And so the crucified figure was solemnly cast back into the sea. And the very next day, it was found on the exact same spot, among the sand and bent grass at the mouth of the River Nee. And it was therefore deposited in a little church of Dune. And very soon the flocks of pious persons who brought it offerings from all parts made it necessary and possible to rebuild the church, thus sanctified by its presence. Now, the holy effigy of Dune, as it became known, did not work the ordinary sort of miracles, but its fame spread far and wide. It had been discovered without the cross, as I said, to which it had presumably once been fastened, and no researches or subsequent storms brought these missing blocks to light, despite the many prayers which were offered to that end. After some time, therefore, and after a good deal of discussion, it was decided that a new cross should be provided for the effigy to hang upon, and certain skilled stonemasons were summoned to the town for this purpose. But behold, the very day after the new cross had been solemnly erected in the church, an unheard of and terrifying fact was discovered. The effigy, which had been hanging perfectly straight the previous evening, had shifted position, and it was bent violently to the right, as if in an effort to break loose. Now, this was attested not merely by hundreds of laymen, but by the priests themselves, who notified the abbot of Saint-Lô, their spiritual overlord. And this was the beginning of a series of mysterious occurrences which spread the fame of the marvelous crucifix all over Christendom. Now, the effigy did not long stay in the position into which it had miraculously worked itself. It was found at intervals of time shifted in some other manner upon its cross, but always as if it had gone through violent contortions. And one day, after about 10 years after it had been cast up by the sea, the priests of the church and the burghers of Doon discovered the effigy hanging in its original outstretched symmetrical attitude, with the cross broken in 3 pieces and lying on the steps of the chapel. Now, certain persons who lived in the end of the town nearest to the church reported to have been roused in the middle of the night by what they had taken for a violent clap of thunder, and that was doubtless the crash of the cross falling down, or perhaps, as some fancifully suggested, the noise with which the effigy had broken loose from and spurned the alien cross. For that had to be the secret, that the figure, made by a saint and come to the town by a miracle, had evidently found some trace of unholiness in the stone to which it had been fastened. Well, that at least was the explanation offered by the prior of the church in answer to an angry summons of the abbot of Saint-Lô, who expressed his strong disapproval of such unusual miracles. And so a new cross was ordered, although it was noticed that much time was lost about it, and the consecration did not take place until some years later. Meanwhile, the prior had built the warder's chamber with its fireplace and recess in the church, and he had obtained permission from the Pope himself for a clerk in orders to be appointed to keep watch day and night to prevent so wonderful a relic from being stolen. Because you see, by now, the effigy had achieved great fame, and the village of Doon, through the concourse of pilgrims, had grown into a bustling town, that the property of the now fabulously wealthy Priory of the Holy Cross. The abbots of Saint-Lô, meanwhile, looked upon the matter with an unfavourable eye. Although nominally remaining their vassals, the priors of Doon had contrived to obtain from the Pope privileges which rendered them virtually independent, as well as immunities which sent to the treasury of Saint-Lô only a small proportion of the tribute money brought in by the pilgrims. Abbot Valterius, in particular, showed himself actively hostile to Doon. He accused the prior of having employed his warders to trump up stories about the still crossless effigy, and of suggesting to the ignorant changes in the figure's attitude which were more credulously believed in now that there was no longer the straight line of the cross by which to verify them. So finally, a new cross was made and consecrated, and on Holy Cross Day, the figure was fastened to it in the presence of a large concourse of clergy and laity. Now, the effigy, it was supposed, would now be satisfied, and no unusual occurrences would increase or compromise its reputation for sanctity. These expectations, however, were violently dispelled. In November 1293, after a year of strange rumours, the effigy was again discovered to have moved. And it continued moving, or perhaps more properly, judging from its position, writhing. And on Christmas Eve of the same year, the cross was a second time thrown down and dashed in pieces. Now, another cross was made, and this time privately consecrated and put in place, and a hole in the roof made a pretext to close the church for a while and to perform the rites of purification necessary after its pollution by workmen. Indeed, it was remarked that on this occasion, the prior of Doon took as much trouble to diminish and, if possible, conceal the miracles as his predecessor had done his best to blazon the earlier ones abroad. The priest who had been on duty that eventful Christmas Eve disappeared mysteriously, and he was thought by many to have been confined in the prior's prison for fear of the revelations that he might make. Because by this time, and not without some encouragement from the abbots at Arras, extraordinary stories had begun to circulate about the goings-on in the church of Doon. Now, the church, remember, stood a little above the town, and it was isolated among big trees. It was surrounded by the precincts of the priory, and save on the water side by high walls. And yet, there were persons who affirmed that they had heard strange noises coming from the church on certain nights. During storms in particular, they said, sounds had been heard which were variously described as howls, groans, and the music of rustic dancing. A master mariner affirmed that one Halloween, as his boat approached the mouth of the river, he'd seen the church of Doon brilliantly lit up, its immense windows flaming. Now, he was suspected of having been drunk and of having exaggerated the effect of the small light shining from the warder's chamber. And these tales were all promptly hushed up by the priory and the townsfolk. But somehow, you see, they managed to reach the ear of the abbot of Saint-Leu. And at last there came an event which brought them all back to the surface. Because on the Vigil of All Saints, 1299, the church was struck by lightning. The new warder was found dead in the middle of the nave. The latest cross was broken in two, and, horror of horrors, the effigy was missing. Now, the indescribable fear which overcame everyone was merely increased by the subsequent discovery of the effigy lying behind the high altar in an attitude of frightful convulsion, and, it was whispered, blackened by lightning. Well, an ecclesiastical council was held at Arras, and the church shut once more for nearly a year. And it was opened this time and reconsecrated by the abbot of Saint-Leu, whom the prior of the Holy Cross served humbly at Mass. Now, a new chapel had been built, and in it the miraculous crucifix was displayed, dressed in more splendid brocade and gems than usual, and its head nearly hidden by one of the most gorgeous crowns ever seen, a gift, it was said, of the Duke of Burgundy himself. Now, all this splendour and the presence of the great abbot himself was presently explained to the faithful when the prior came forward to announce that a last and greatest miracle had now taken place. The original cross, he said, on which the figure had hung in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and for which the effigy had spurned all others made by less holy hands, had been cast on the shore of Doon, on the very spot where 100 years before the figure of the Saviour had been discovered in the sands. This, said the prior, was the explanation of the terrible occurrences which had filled all hearts with anguish. But the holy effigy was now satisfied, he promised. It would rest in peace, and its miraculous powers would be engaged only in granting the prayers of the faithful. Well, one half of his forecast came true. From that day forward, the effigy never again shifted its position. But from that day forward also, no considerable miracle was ever attributed to it, and the devotion of Doon diminished accordingly. Other relics threw the sacred effigy into the shade. The pilgrimages dwindled to mere local gatherings, and the great church was never brought towards completion. Now, what had happened? Well, no one ever knew, guessed, or perhaps even asked. But you see, when in 1790 the archiepiscopal palace of Arras was sacked, a certain notary of the neighbourhood bought a large portion of the archives at the price of waste paper, either from historical curiosity or perhaps more likely expecting to obtain thereby facts which might gratify his aversion to the clergy. Now, these documents lay unexamined for many years until my friend the antiquary bought them. Among them, taken helter-skelter from the Archbishop's palace, were sundry papers referring to the suppressed abbey of Saint-Loup of Arras, and among these latter, a series of notes concerning the affairs of the Church of Doon, the fragmentary minutes of an inquest made in 1309, which contained the deposition of sundry witnesses. Now, to fully understand the meaning of these, you've got to remember that this was a time when witch trials had begun, and when the proceedings against the Templars had set the fashion for inquests, which could help the finances of the country while also furthering the interest of religion. What appears to have happened is that after the catastrophe of the Vigil of All Saints, October 1299, the prior of Doon, Urbain de Luc, found himself suddenly threatened with a charge of sacrilege and witchcraft, of obtaining miracles of the effigy by devilish means, and of converting his church into a chapel of the evil one. Now, instead of appealing to high ecclesiastical tribunals, as the privilege obtained from the Holy See would have warranted, Prior Urban guessed that this charge came originally from the wrathful abbot of Saint-Loup, and dropping all his pretensions in order to save himself, he threw himself upon the mercy of the abbot, whom he had hitherto flouted. The abbot appears to have been satisfied by his submission, and the matter was dropped after a few legal preliminaries. And it is the notes of these that were found among the archiepiscopal archives of Arras, and which I can now read to you. Now, some of these notes, my friend the antiquary has allowed me to translate from the Latin, and as I say, I read them to you now, leaving you to make what you can of them. So, item. The abbot expresses himself satisfied that his reverence the prior has had no personal knowledge of or dealings with the evil one, Diabolus. Nevertheless, the gravity of the charge requires, and I'm afraid there the page is torn, but it continues, Robert Jacot, Simon Le Couvreur, and Pierre Denis, burghers of Doon, being interrogated, witness that the noises from the Church of the Holy Cross always happened on the nights of bad storms and foreboded shipwrecks on the coast, and were very various, such as terrible rattling, groans, howls as of wolves, and occasional flute playing. A certain Jean, who has twice been branded and flogged for lighting fires on the coast and causing ships to wreck at the mouth of the river, being promised immunity after 2 or 3 slight pulls on the rack, witnesses as follows: that the band of wreckers to which he belongs always knew when a dangerous storm was brewing on account of the noises which issued from the church of Doon. Witness has often climbed the walls and prowled around in the churchyard waiting to hear such noises. He was not unfamiliar with the howlings and roarings mentioned by the previous witnesses. He has further heard tell by a countryman who passed in the night that the howling was such that the countryman thought himself pursued by a pack of wolves, although it is well known that no wolf has been seen in these parts for 30 years. But the witness himself is of the opinion that the most singular of all the noises, and the one which always foretold the worst storms, was a noise of flutes and pipes, so sweet that the King of France could not have sweeter at his court. Being interrogated whether he had ever seen anything, the witness answers that he has seen the church brightly lit up from the sands, but on approaching found all dark save the light from the warder's chamber. That once by moonlight, the piping and fluting and howling being uncommonly loud, he thought he had seen wolves and a human figure on the roof, but that he ran away from fear and cannot be sure. Item: His Lordship the Abbot desires the Right Reverend Prior to answer truly, placing his hand on the Gospels, whether or not he himself had heard such noises. The Right Reverend Prior denies ever having heard anything similar, but being threatened with further proceedings, probably the rack again, he acknowledges that he had frequently been told of these noises by the warder on duty. Query: was the Right Reverend Prior ever told anything else by the warder? Answer: yes, but under the seal of confession. The last warder, moreover, the one killed by lightning, had been a reprobate priest, having committed crimes and obliged to take asylum, whom the prior had kept there on account of the difficulty of finding a man sufficiently courageous for the office. Query: did the prior ever question previous warders? Answer: the warders were bound to reveal only in confession what they had heard. The prior's predecessors had kept the seal of confession inviolate, and that though unworthy, the prior himself desired to do alike. Query: what had become of the warder who had been found in a swoon after the occurrences of Halloween? Answer: the prior does not know. The warder was crazy. The prior believes that he was secluded for that reason. But I'm afraid to say that a disagreeable surprise had been arranged for Prior Urban de Luc, because the next entry states, item: by order of His Magnificence the Lord Abbot, certain servants of the Lord Abbot introduce Luc Baudouin, priest, once warder in the Church of the Holy Cross, who has been kept 10 years in prison by His Reverence the Prior as being of unsound mind. Witness manifests great terror on finding himself in the presence of their lordships, and particularly of His Reverence the Prior, and he refuses to speak, hiding his face in his hands and uttering shrieks. Being threatened with the rack if he continue obdurate, this witness deposes as follows, although not without much lamentation, shrieking, and senseless jabber. Query: can he remember what happened on the Vigil of All Saints in the Church of Doon before he swooned on the floor of the church? Answer: it would be sin to speak of such things before great spiritual lords. Moreover, he is but an ignorant man and also mad. Moreover, his hunger is great. Being given white bread from the Lord's Abbot's own table, witness is again cross-questioned. Query: what can he remember of the events of the Vigil of All Saints? Answer: thinks he was not always mad. Thinks he has not always been in prison. Thinks he once went in a boat on the sea. Query: does witness think he has ever been in the Church of Doon? Answer: cannot remember, but is sure that he was not always in prison. Query: has witness ever heard anything like this? My Lord the Abbot, having secretly ordered a certain fool in his service, an excellent musician, should suddenly play the pipes behind the arras, at which sound witness began to tremble and sob and fall on his knees and catch hold of the robe of my Lord the Abbot, holding his head therein. Query: wherefore does he feel such terror, being in the fatherly presence of so clement a prince as the Lord Abbot? Answer: that witness cannot stand the piping. It freezes his blood. He has told the prior many times that he will not remain any longer in the warder's chamber. He is afraid for his life. He dare not make the sign of the cross, nor say his prayers, for fear of the great wild man. The great wild man took the cross and broke it, and played at quoits with it in the nave. And then all the wolves trooped down from the roof and howled and danced on their hind legs, while the great wild man played the pipes on the high altar. He had surrounded himself with a hedge of little crosses made of broken rice straw to keep off the great wild man from the warder's chamber. He is piping again. The wolves are howling. He is raising the tempest. Item, that no further information can be extracted from witness, who falls on the floor like one possessed and has to be removed from the presence of his lordship the abbot and his reverence the prior. And it is at that point that the minutes of the inquest break off. Now, did those great spiritual dignitaries ever get to learn more about the terrible doings in the Church of Doon? I mean, did they ever guess at their cause? There was a cause, said the antiquary, folding his spectacles after reading me these notes. En fait, the cause still exists. Come with me, you will understand. And rising, he fetched a key from a shelf and preceded me into the yard of his house, situated on the river, a mile below Doon. Between the low steadings, one saw the salt marsh, lilac with sea lavender, the island of birds, a great sandbank at the mouth of the river, where every kind of seafowl gathers, and beyond, the white-crested sea under an angry orange afterglow. On the other side, inland, appearing above the farm roofs, stood the church, its pointed belfry and jagged outlines of gables and buttresses, gargoyles and wind-warped pines black against the red easterly sky. I told you, monsieur, that there had been a substitution, that the effigy today in Doon is not the one that was cast up by the storm. No, I believe that the present figure may be identified as a life-size statue for which a receipt exists in the archive of Dallas from the year 1209. That is to say, the year of the inquest and the cessation of all occurrence supernatural. As for the original effigy, well, you shall see, and you shall understand. He opened the door of a sloping vaulted passage, lit a lantern, and led the way. It was evidently the cellar of some medieval building. A scent of wine and fir branches filled the darkness among thick-set columns. Voila, said the antiquary, raising his lantern. He was buried beneath his vault, and they had run an iron stake through his middle like a vampire to prevent his rising. The effigy was erect against the dark wall, surrounded by brushwood. It was more than life-size, and nude. The arms were broken off at the shoulders. The head, with stubbly beard and clotted hair, drawn up with an effort. The face was contracted in agony. The muscles dragged as of one hanging crucified, and the feet were bound together with a rope. The figure was familiar to me from various art galleries. I went forward to examine the ear, and I saw that it was leaf-shaped. I see you have understood the mystery, said the antiquary. Well, I've understood, I said, not knowing how far his thought really went, that this supposed statue of Christ is, in fact, an antique satyr. It's Marsyas awaiting his punishment. The antiquary nodded. Exactement. That is the whole explanation. And I think perhaps the abbot and the prior, they were not so wrong to drive an iron stake through him when they removed him from the church.